Rome, 537 AD, you are a grain merchant named Flavius, and you have lived your entire life within the sound of water. Not the Tiber, brown and sluggish below the city. The other water, the water that arrived from the hills in a continuous, thunderous rush through 11 stone channels stretching hundreds of miles in every direction, water that came out of the mouths of lions carved in marble, water that filled the public baths where 1,200 people bathed simultaneously every afternoon. Water that ran through the streets, constant and clean, overflow pouring into channels that flushed the sewers beneath your feet. Rome moved 1 million people's worth of water every single day through infrastructure that had no parallel anywhere on Earth. This morning it stopped, not a gradual slowing, a hard stop. The Ostrogoth general Witigis cut the aqueduct channels outside the city walls during his siege, and the water that had flowed without interruption for 6 centuries simply ceased to arrive. The fountains went dry within hours, the baths closed by afternoon. By evening, the city of 1 million people was calculating, for the first time in living memory, how far they were from the nearest river. Flavius knows the answer. 300 meters to the Tiber. He has never thought about it before. He has never needed to. This isn't dystopian fiction. This was Rome in the 6th century, and the aqueducts were never fully repaired. In the 3 centuries that followed, Rome's population fell from 1 million to somewhere between 20 and 30,000. The greatest urban water system in human history became a ruin. Medieval Romans planted their vegetable gardens inside the shells of the old bath complexes, using the channels that had once carried clean water from the Apennines to irrigate their cabbages. Here is the question that actually matters. When the most advanced infrastructure system in the ancient world collapsed overnight, what held value? I went through the forensic record, the papyri from Roman Egypt, the chronicles of Procopius, who documented the Gothic Wars firsthand, the archaeological surveys of how Rome's population distributed itself across the city as the system failed. Not theory, not speculation, what people actually did, what actually worked. By the end of this video, you will know exactly which 4 assets outlived the water collapse and which ones became worthless the moment the flow stopped. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Before we get to the assets, understand the mechanism, because the aqueduct collapse didn't happen in a single day. The siege of 537 was the rupture, but the vulnerability had been accumulating for generations. Stage 1. The system was built for a city that no longer existed. Rome's population had been declining since the 3rd century. The aqueducts were designed for 1 million people at peak imperial capacity. By 500 AD, the population may have been half that. The infrastructure was overbuilt relative to the people maintaining it. Stage 2, the maintenance workforce eroded. The specialized engineers who understood how to seal aqueduct joints, how to manage the gradient, how to clear sediment from the settling tanks, these were imperial employees funded by central tax revenue. As the Western Empire fragmented, the revenue dried up. The knowledge began to disappear with the engineers who held it. Stage 3, the political system stopped protecting the infrastructure. Every previous barbarian ruler of Italy, Odoacer, Theodoric, had kept the aqueducts running because they understood the city required them. Witigis cut them deliberately as a weapon of war. It took one decision, made by one military commander, to end 6 centuries of continuous flow. Stage 4, total systemic failure. With no water, no sanitation, no supply chain for food that had depended on the Tiber trade network, and no government capable of mounting repair operations, the system crossed a threshold it could not come back from. Same pattern as every monetary collapse in this channel's archive. Different asset class, identical architecture. The people who survived and retained functional lives were not the ones who had invested most heavily in the imperial system. They were the ones who had built redundancy below it. Number 1. Land with direct water access, not land near the aqueduct network. Land over groundwater. Here is the forensic evidence. As Rome's population collapsed after the 6th century, the surviving population did not distribute itself randomly across the city. It clustered in 2 areas with striking consistency: the low-lying floodplain of the Tiber called the Campus Martius, and the neighborhoods built over natural springs. The Capitoline Hill had wells. The Trastevere district sat directly on the Tiber bank. These are the areas where continuous habitation was documented through the darkest centuries of Rome's medieval period. The hilltop neighborhoods that had depended entirely on aqueduct pressure. Neighborhoods that had been prestigious, expensive, and densely populated during imperial times, emptied out within a generation of the aqueduct failure. What preserved value was not the location itself. It was the hydrological reality beneath the location. A piece of land sitting over a shallow aquifer, reachable by a hand-dug well 30 feet deep, was worth more after 537 than a marble villa with no water source within half a mile. The archaeology confirms this. The well density in surviving medieval neighborhoods is extraordinary. Romans who stayed dug constantly, not because they chose to live primitively, but because digging a well was the difference between staying and leaving. The practical logic is identical to what we see in monetary collapse. When the centralized supply of a critical resource is cut, the people who survive are the ones with direct, personal access to the underlying physical thing. In monetary collapse, it's the person holding physical gold instead of a bank account denominated in a collapsing currency. In the water collapse, it's the family holding land over groundwater instead of a connection to an aqueduct that no longer flows. The mechanism is brutally simple. Analog assets are assets that function regardless of whether the system is running. A well works whether or not the empire exists. An aqueduct requires the empire to maintain it, defend it, and fund the engineers who know how to fix it. Number 2, practical water skills. The engineers who understood how water moved were the most valuable people in Rome after the collapse. Not rhetoricians, not lawyers, not the educated class whose income depended on the functioning of imperial institutions. The equari, the specialized workers who maintained the aqueducts, held knowledge that became more valuable, not less, as the system deteriorated. They knew how to read groundwater. They knew how to line a cistern to prevent contamination. They knew how to calculate the gradient required for gravity flow over short distances. They could take a ruined bath complex and redirect the water from a nearby spring into a usable channel using nothing but basic tools and knowledge accumulated across generations. Procopius, writing during the Gothic Wars, documented something remarkable. Even during active military sieges, the population of Rome that survived best was concentrated around the people who knew how to find and move water, not around political officials, not around wealthy merchants whose wealth was tied to the trade network, around the practical craftsmen. This pattern repeats across every infrastructure collapse in the historical record. In the aftermath of Zimbabwe's economic collapse, the most resilient communities were the ones with members who retained practical productive skills. In post-Soviet collapse documentation, medical professionals and skilled tradespeople who could provide services directly, outside the broken institutional infrastructure, were the ones who maintained their standard of living. Skills cannot be confiscated by a siege. Skills cannot be devalued by a currency reform. Skills cannot be frozen by a government decree. Whatever happens to the system, the person who knows how to find water in a city that has lost its supply is irreplaceable. The practical implication is the same one every economic autopsy points to. The families that survived Argentina's 2001 collapse were the dentists and electricians whose value was expressed in what they could do, not in what their account balance said. The water engineers of 6th century Rome were the dentists of their era, and when the system collapsed, everyone needed them. Number 3, community cisterns and local collective infrastructure. This is the most counterintuitive asset, and it's the one most people miss. When the central water supply failed, the church moved faster than any other institution to fill the gap. The great basilicas of early medieval Rome, Santa Maria Maggiore, San Giovanni in Laterano, San Pietro, all maintained internal cisterns. They had been built with independent water storage not as luxury but as institutional memory. The church had been present through enough sieges and disruptions to understand that any system depending on a single supply point was vulnerable. The neighborhoods organized around these church complexes survived the population collapse better than any others, not primarily for theological reasons, for hydrological ones. The basilica had water. The community gathered around the water. The community that gathered around the water had the collective labor to maintain the cistern, the collective knowledge to use it efficiently, and the collective security to defend it. The forensic record from Roman Egypt during the 3rd century crisis tells the same story. When the imperial monetary system collapsed and trade networks fragmented, the communities that maintained functioning local economies were the ones with pre-existing collective infrastructure: shared grain storage, shared water management, shared security. Here is the mechanism that matters. Collective local infrastructure is an analog asset because it doesn't require the central system to function. A neighborhood cistern holding 6 months of water supply, maintained by 30 families with the practical knowledge to keep it clean, is completely independent of whether the aqueducts are running, whether the empire is intact, whether the supply chain from the eastern provinces is functioning. During the Lebanese financial collapse, the communities that maintained access to basic resources were the ones with established collective relationships. Generators shared among apartment buildings, water storage coordinated between neighbors, food sourced through informal community networks rather than through the banking system that had frozen. The pattern is consistent. The analog asset here is not the cistern itself. It's the social infrastructure that maintains the cistern. And social infrastructure, like a well, must be dug before you need it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Number 4, store durables with independent utility. When the water stopped, everything that depended on water stopped with it. The baths, the fulling mills that cleaned wool using water power, the bakeries that depended on a continuous water supply for dough production at scale, the urban economy that had been built assuming water was free, abundant, and automatically available. The families that maintained functional lives during the collapse had something that none of those industries required: stored goods with immediate self-contained utility. Olive oil, preserved grain, dried legumes, tools, basic medicines, seeds. The Roman villa system in the Italian countryside had always operated on a storage logic that urban Romans had largely abandoned. A well-managed agricultural estate stored a full year's production not as excess but as operating buffer against the unpredictability that was simply part of agricultural life. Drought, blight, war, flood. The estate's survival logic was built around the assumption that outside supply chains would sometimes fail. When the urban system collapsed, the families with a villa outside the city, or the family in the city that had maintained a small store of provisions, had options that the family fully dependent on daily market supply did not. In the immediate aftermath of the aqueduct failure, the city's food supply was disrupted because the grain mills that ground flour relied on water. The families with stored flour did not need to calculate when the mills would reopen. In Zimbabwe, in 2008, a bar of soap had more reliable purchasing power than a $100 trillion banknote. That is not metaphor. That is the arithmetic of a system that failed faster than it could be replaced. The families who had physical goods with enduring utility, fuel, medicine, tools, preserved food, had a parallel economy available to them when the official one stopped functioning. The principle is identical in every collapse. Stored durables are analog assets because they retain function regardless of what the system is doing. They are the physical equivalent of gold in a monetary crisis, not because they are rare or precious, but because they are real, and real things do not collapse when the promise behind them collapses. Now, what went to zero? Property connected only to the aqueduct network. The great thermal bath complexes, the baths of Caracalla, the baths of Diocletian, the baths of Trajan, required over 1 million gallons of fresh water per day to operate. When the flow stopped, their value went to zero, not gradually, but instantly. These were among the most expensive construction projects in Roman history. They became ruins within a generation. Urban commercial real estate depended on foot traffic from a functioning city. The merchants, the money changers, the luxury goods traders, whose businesses required a dense urban population with spending power, their income streams collapsed as the population dispersed to find water and food outside the city. Social status denominated in the imperial system. The cursus honorum, the formal Roman career ladder of magistracies and offices that had determined a man's social position for centuries, was a claim against an institutional system. When the institutional system fragmented, the claim became meaningless. A man who was a former consul in 530 AD had a title. He did not necessarily have water. The lesson the water collapse teaches is the same one every monetary collapse teaches. The assets that went to zero were the ones whose value existed only within the system. The assets that survived were the ones whose value existed independently of it. The pattern is not ancient history. The Texas power grid failure of February 2021, 16 million people without water for days, sometimes weeks, not because the physical water was gone, but because the infrastructure that delivered it failed. The families who came through that event without catastrophic disruption were the families who had stored water, who had alternative heating, who had neighbors they could call. The Beirut port explosion of 2020 disrupted the water supply for a city already living through a financial collapse. The communities that maintained access to basic resources were the ones with collective local infrastructure, shared generators, established mutual aid relationships, independent water storage. The lesson from Rome is not that complex systems are bad. Rome's aqueducts were one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history. The lesson is that complex systems require continuous institutional support to function. When that support fails, whether through fiscal collapse, military defeat, political fragmentation, or simple neglect, the people who survive are the ones who maintained analog capabilities beneath the complex system, land with direct water access, practical skills, community infrastructure, stored durables with independent utility. These are not medieval solutions. They are the documented survival behaviors of every population that has lived through infrastructure collapse. The mechanism is consistent. The pattern is visible before the collapse arrives, just as it was visible to the Romans who watched the aqueduct maintenance workforce dwindle for decades before Witigis raised his sword. Rise his sword. Flavius, the grain merchant, ends this story. He made it through the siege, not because he was wealthy, not because he was politically connected, because 3 years before the Goths arrived, during a summer when the aqueduct pressure dropped for 2 weeks due to a repair failure nobody had the budget to fix quickly, he dug a well in his courtyard. His neighbors thought it was unnecessary. The aqueduct came back on. When the flow stopped for good in 537, Flavius had water. His neighbors came to him first. He didn't turn them away. The network that formed around that courtyard, sharing water, sharing food, sharing labor, was still functioning 50 years later when his grandson was born. The empire's water collapsed. The courtyard well did not. History always asks the same question, not whether the system will fail. It will, The systems always do eventually, in every empire, in every century. The question is whether you have dug your well before the aqueduct stops. If this forensic breakdown gave you a new lens for understanding what real resilience looks like, subscribe to this channel. We study the autopsies before they become relevant. Drop a well and bucket emoji in the comments if you're already building analog capacity. I read every single one. I remember what Flavius understood without anyone explaining it to him. The most sophisticated infrastructure in the world is worth exactly zero if you have no access to it when it stops. Go build what functions without the system. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.